Okay, everybody, welcome to the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Quiet, please. Finish up your conversations. I know it's exciting. We have a wonderful program today that I'm going to introduce Tony Novosel, Dr. Tony Novosel from the University of Pittsburgh. And he's going to just offer us his wonderful knowledge about all the work that he has done over how many years?
26 years of actual working stuff.
Great.
50 years of training.
And I have to say,
To prepare you.
a week and a half ago, all I knew about Tony was that pretender at Chiodos. And I had a wonderful learning experience over the week. I listened to his podcast. I have read a lot about him. And so I am just so excited to be able to be up here to introduce him to all of you, and that all of you will be able to hear about a magnificent career that is still ongoing. I'm going to hold off. I was telling Tony I was going to ask who wanted to say something afterward, but we will hold off on that until after his speech. He's got a speech prepared and we are recorded. So
Don't say any bad words.
yeah, don't say any bad words. Be nice. So anyway, going to turn over Tony's introduction to Charlie, because he's the one that told me when we were at Chiodos, 2 weeks ago, July 6th. Oh, Tony Novosel.
I was behind the bar that
Yeah,
day.
you were behind the bar. So I will turn it over to our expert historian here.
Yeah, I really appreciate also Mark Fallon, and he and I think for years we talked, get Tony up here and tell this story, because I didn't know the depth of the story, but I knew he had a hell of a story, and I knew he was a great bartender, great listener, so I think what I heard is terrific, and people should try to listen to the hour-long interview on Belfast radio of him when he was getting his MBE, the British Empire, and not too many of the folks at this table have had such exalted honors, but that really Tony began in a way by hitchhiking to Istanbul, was something which I deeply relate to, having done it a couple of times, and I used to talk one time. Stoughton Lind asked me what was the deepest feeling of accompaniment I ever had. I said hitchhiking.
Yeah.
Every time that car stopped, you never knew what you were getting into, literally, and it was an incredible experience of understanding borders and cultures and peoples. But on top of the travel side of it, he also set down deep roots by sort of an accident. I mean, in a sense, it's sort of like I found Pittsburgh, he found Belfast, and he'll tell us about that. But to really try to understand another place, I think one of the things we learned with Alice Lynn is the importance of place, of Youngstown, what they did in Youngstown when they went there and tried to learn as much as they could about this place and what they could do to help. And Tony has done that very deeply too. And so Tony unites his depth of experience, but he also then worked, and this is, I think, maybe the most important thing, to give other people the same experience of experiencing something, knowing something different than their own place. And he helped in Northern Ireland with dozens, hundreds of people to come to the United States, live in all kinds of situations, and become deep in their understanding of the human condition and of this country and their own people. And finally, he's somebody who balanced, I think, good sociability as a bartender and intellectual achievement with a PhD. And I think this table and the people at it honor him greatly for what he's done. Well, thank you very much, Tony Novosel.
Thank you, sure. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you.
Tony, just
Okay.
before, I want you to tell you that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people on Zoom.
I see some people I know.
Yes, but you know who's there. I see some waves. So we will introduce them to you afterward as well.
Okay.
You're on.
Thanks for having me today. One of the things, don't be worried. This is 8 pages, but I double spaced it and put a 14-point font. so I could lose, and I timed it at under 10 minutes, so I will not be babbling on and on and on today. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. And actually, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure what I was going to speak about today. So I was really glad to see the email that you sent out this week. So it actually gave me the focus of what I would talk about rather than me rambling. And I'll try to do this as briefly as possible, and then I can answer your questions that you may have at the end. One note, I did create a PowerPoint with images of what I will talk about in below, and I will show that after the talk. I didn't have time to integrate the two together getting ready for this. So as Charlie was saying, I first went to Northern Ireland in 1974 because I had met students from Northern Ireland while I was working in Wildwood, New Jersey in 1973. Since then, I've been back approximately 85 times and have another trip coming up in September. In the 70s, I spent time in Portrush on the North Antrim coast, where I also worked as a bartender. In Belfast, I trained with a team from the nationalist area Chronic Albion from the Markets District of Belfast. In the early 2000s, I got involved in women's soccer, doing training sessions for women's teams in Belfast. And during the peace talks leading to the Good Friday Agreement, I designed and I ran the website for the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, who were actually involved in the peace talks. In 1995, through a good friend, I met Billy Hutchinson, a former UVF life prisoner, and then a loyalist politician. And this began my engagement with the Protestant working class community, the loyalist paramilitaries, and my work on the political history and progressive development of progressive politics in the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Red Hand Commando, two of the loyalist paramilitary groups. This work resulted in and here's my shameless plug, my book, Northern Ireland's Lost Opportunity, The Frustrated Promise of Political Loyalism, okay, which I won't go in deeply. If you have questions, I can talk about it. As part of that work, between 2009 and 2015, I did a series of talks with the UVF and the Red Hand Commando, as well as talks with Republican groups and mixed audiences about my research and on the loyalist political evolution and their prison experience. In 2010 and 2011, I met with the senior commanders of both the Red Hand Commando and the UVF, respectively, to discuss my research and how they could use it in their transition away from paramilitarism. A side note, and it'll be on the slide, my book is now part of a permanent exhibit in the Action for Community Transformation Center, a UVF conflict transformation initiative. Also, Mitchell McLaughlin, a leading member of Sinn Féin, actually gave me a favorable review in 2013 in the Republican newspaper on Flo Blog. At the same time I was doing all this, I began volunteering with the then Business Education Initiative, now Study USA, in 1996. I did that through 2022. The BEI Study USA program came about after the 94 ceasefires and is now managed by the British Council. It sends final year university students from Northern Ireland to small liberal arts colleges in America. It was originally designed to assist with the peace process and provide a unique international experience for students. My role over those 26 years, in which I actually worked with over 2,500 students, was to prepare them for the culture shock of America, for anything and everything they might experience as in America, as well as how to adjust to the American higher educational system. Once in America, I dealt with all their problems that they encountered, and you can imagine there were many. But it was worth it for me, and I loved it. I got to witness the students growing and changing from the fear that I saw the year during the orientations, the previous year, for the better, and in the British Council's words, return with the skills and experience that are vital in developing Northern Ireland's economy. Excuse me. In 2004, I created a class about the conflict for my Pitt students. After I completed the full design, I sent the syllabus to a former UVF prisoner and then politician, a well-known non-aligned activist, and an Irish Republican in Northern Ireland. I did this to make sure it was as fair as possible. They all gave it 2 thumbs up. On a humorous note, the loyalist, when he saw the workload, wrote, "I'm just glad I don't have to do all that work." Okay. On the syllabus, I provide a rationale statement because of time. I'll only read a portion of it. And I write, the historical and political situation in Northern Ireland is loaded emotionally for many Americans of Irish descent. What this class will attempt to do is take the emotion and the preconceived notions out of the discussion and instead analyze the period and its actors in all their complexity. This class will not romanticize or heroicize revolutionary and or counter-revolutionary violence. Violence, regardless of its purpose, claims real and often innocent victims, leaving behind a ruthless deposit of hatred and hurt that is hard, if not impossible, to overcome. Then in the first class, I tell them we will seek to understand why the violence occurred and why people made the decision to kill. In doing this, I constantly stress understanding does not mean condoning. Once we start the class, we deal not only with the Republican nationalist narrative, which is the most popular, we also pull in the unionist loyalist narrative, and Steffi has been there, she knows this, okay? And Joe online knows this as well. Examining how the British government and Irish governments acted and why. We also deal with victims and survivors of the conflict. To do this, we incorporate readings and meetings that cover all sides. I use one book that has a broad narrative written by a journalist that covers 1921 to 1998. Two other books I use, both by Peter Taylor, a brilliant journalist, one which focuses on the conflict through the eyes of Republican, and the other on the conflict through the eyes of loyalists. The last book is mine, which I can't profit from it. I will profit right now. My wife and I have set up a $2,000 yearly scholarship for study abroad at Pitt, because you're not allowed to profit from using your own book in the classroom. So I want to stress that at the beginning. Okay, and it gives a unique, unfamiliar perspective by studying the political development of loyalism, both inside and outside the prisons. I use interviews that I and others have done with key figures from both sides of conflict, as well as good documentaries, not some of the ones you find on YouTube. Okay, every term I have guest speakers who provide them with a wide array of perspectives. A friend of mine who was in the IRA and survived Bloody Sunday speaks to the class every term. The very next week, every term, another friend of mine who was a former life prisoner from the Ulster Volunteer Force, who got his PhD in 2012, speaks to them about his life story and his PhD, which focused on why people kill, including himself, and made the decision to kill. One of the founders of the Women's Coalition has spoken to them, as well as many academics and community activists from both sides. I always bring in two friends and experts on the prison system during the conflict, both of whom we are fortunate to have in Pittsburgh. One is Dr. Rachel Oppenheimer, who is a leading expert on the IRA prison protests and the hunger strikes and their political impact. The other is Dr. Aaron Hinson, who is the expert on how loyalists used art in the prisons to negotiate their identities and control the space. At the end of each term, I have someone who was a victim, and as they experienced the violence that traumatized them, or they were directly affected by the violence physically. For instance, in December 2022, Alan McBride spoke to them about his life after the IRA killed his wife and father-in-law in the 1993 Shankill bomb. I also have a friend who is now 46 and lives in New Zealand, who still suffers from PTSD from the abuse at the hands of the army and violence from loyalists when she was a teenager. Speak to them about her life. In 2008, 10, and 12, a number of students who took this class did a 2-week field trip to Northern Ireland. While there, they met face-to-face with ex-prisoners and combatants from both sides. They met with victims groups, school groups, and their teachers from both communities. They met with academics, journalists, politicians. And in 2012, the deputy chief constable of the PSNI, the second highest ranking police officer in Northern Ireland, had a face-to-face discussion with them. In 2012, the students had the unique opportunity of meeting the 6-member brigadier staff of one of the loyalist paramilitary groups, the Ulster Defense Association. You'll see a slide. I tracked our trip just to give you an indication. It was a 12-day on-the-ground trip. They had 76.5 face-to-face hours in 12 days. They were exhausted by the time they came home. Okay. And as you can imagine, in both class and the field trips, they came and still come out of all this with whiplash. So at the end, and regardless of their sympathies or beliefs coming into the class, they learn to deal with multiple and conflicting narratives and histories. They also learn why so many ordinary people just like them and at their age did horrible things. And all being well, they also come to understand how studying the conflict can help them to understand other conflicts. I do leave them with one final lesson, and that is the personal human lesson. A very close friend of mine, a former UVF commander and life prisoner who now works to reintegrate Loyalist ex-prisoners into societies, expressed this best in 2016 when my wife was dying of cancer. He knew Alice very well, as she was well known and she was well liked amongst ex-loyalist ex-prisoners and combatants. I can explain that in the Q&A. It is actually a humorous story. When checking in on Alice that Christmas, he wrote, "I think about her all the time. In particular, it illustrates to me the futility of conflict when life presents us with enough heartache and hurt without inflicting it upon ourselves." Okay, thanks. Okay. So I got that in, and so bring PowerPoint up, and actually a bunch of the stuff I talked about will be in the PowerPoint.
Wrong one.
Okay.
We'll get.
Again. There you go.
The share.
Okay. Okay. Bring up it. Reading from mode.
Yeah.
Yeah, whichever one. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So first, let me come back. Got it. That's for those of you who've not been to Belfast. That's the peace wall, as it's known. That separates the Falls Road and the Shankill Road. This is on the Shankill Road side, which is the Loyalist side of the peace wall. The reason they kept building in stages the wall because young people got really good at throwing bricks and firebombs over it, so they put the fence as high as they could. So when I did this research, the first talk I ever did was in 2009 at the Northern Ireland Supporters Club on the Shankill Road. And this was with 50 members of the Red Hand Commando and the UVF. And the reason there's no pictures of the audience is because nobody in the audience wanted their photograph taken that day. But these are all former combatants and former prisoners who had been in the UVF and Red Hand. And they were coming, this was at the start of my research. So word got out what I was doing. I was invited to do this. And so this was the beginning process when I started doing talks all across Belfast.
Tony,
Yes.
can you tell us again what UVF?
Oh, sorry. UVF means Ulster Volunteer Force. Okay, that was one of the main loyalist paramilitary groups. Okay. All right, this is a photograph from 2011. There was a political party, the Progressive Unionist Party, which at the time was the most left-wing party in Northern Ireland. That included Sinn Féin. However, it's basically collapsed by now to this point. But I gave the keynote address at their party conference in 2011 in Belfast. I had been invited to do it. I was invited again to speak in 2018. In 2012, I got invited to speak, and actually, you can't see how bad I really look. I flew in that morning. I got into my apartment at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was an all-day event at the Spectrum Center on the Shankill. We were doing a presentation on the Loyalist prison experience to mainly a Loyalist audience. We did a 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock session and then a 7 to 10 o'clock session that day. But that was me delivering. My discussion at that point was on how Loyalists were using education in the prisons to prepare themselves for politics. This, as I mentioned earlier, this was actually the room at the Action for Community Transformation Center, the UVF Conflict Transformation Initiative. And my book is up in the upper left-hand corner on the wall, but you can see right near my arm, my book's in the cabinet as well, that they now use as part of the education system. And this is actually in the evening at the Spectrum, and that evening of the ACT. And at the table on the speakers, on the middle one, you can see Pete Sherlow, who's now actually, Paul, you would know him. He's at Liverpool now. Pete Sherlow was at Queens. Next to him is Beef Campbell, who was a UVF life prisoner. Next to him was William Mitchell, who was a UVF life prisoner, myself. And then our chairperson was Bobby Rogers, who was a Red Hand Commando life prisoner. And as you can see in the first slide, there we had over the 2 sessions during the day, we had over 400 people showed up to do this. Now, the interesting thing about this one was a number of Republicans came, in particular a guy named Joe Doherty, who did a lot of cross-community work. And at the end of this, when we were doing our panel discussion, he said, "This is great, but you need to bring it over to the Falls Road." So in August, we were invited to the Failure, the People's Festival in West Belfast in 2012, to deliver this same presentation on the Falls Road. To say it was tense was an understatement, because the 4 panelists up front, all 3 were like prisoners except me. And then the 2 guys who were the chair, one was Bobby Story from the IRA, and the other one was Bobby Rogers from the Red Hand Commando. And you can see the audience, and primarily the audience was made up of mainly Irish Republicans. Okay, and the final picture I put in, it's actually kind of funny because this is a little bit after we got started, but I was sitting by myself doing my notes, and all of a sudden, the 4 guys that were sitting together, they all start giggling. I said, "What's so funny?" They said, "We know we're getting the hell out of here, but how are you getting out of here?" Okay. But it went really well, really well. We were welcomed and they had a great discussion. Although the panel discussion got very tense at the end, towards the end. Okay. And then these were just the picture on the left-hand side, to my left, right? I'm not sure you're seeing it. That's with me. That's Gusty Spence. Gusty Spence was the godfather of Ulster Loyalism. He was involved in the first sectarian killings in 1966. But he was also the person who completely changed in prison using education. And he, as early as 1973, was publishing articles in papers claiming the war was over. Nobody was going to win, and there was going to have to be a compromise peace to end the conflict in Northern Ireland. He developed a cadre of young loyalist volunteers, prisoners who came in to the prison, and got them to start thinking about what their position was and what they were going to do. And I'll just tell a quick story. What he would do is every time a loyalist prisoner came into the prison system, he would ask them, "Who are you?" They'd give him a name. "Well, why are you here?" And or "Where are you from?" "East Belfast, 3rd Battalion." "So why are you here?" He said, "Declaring explosives with intent to do harm," or whatever they were charged with. And Gusty would go, No. "Why are you here?" "For defending my people." No. "Why are you here?" And what he wanted to do was he basically was forcing them to think, not what did you do that landed you in prison, but what are the circumstances of this country and your life that forced you to do or led you to do what you did, and how are we going to get out of this? And so Gusty was absolutely instrumental in bringing the loyalists onto C-SPAN by 1994. On the right-hand side, it was by accident. I was taking a tour of students on the Falls Road. The guy on the far right is a guy named Padraig McCotter, who was a former IRA prisoner who I've got to know really well. He always does my tours on the Falls. We're walking up the Falls, and out of the building, the little guy next to me is Billy McKee, who was one of the founders of the Provisional IRA in 1969, and who was the senior commander of the IRA up until he was forced out in the 1970s by the Jerry Adams faction, and for many other reasons that's too long to go into. These are just things I did with the students. This is Monica McWilliams, who was the head of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. She and I actually met in Wildwood in 1973 and stayed friends. She was a human rights commissioner for Northern Ireland for 5 years. She does great human rights work and women's rights work all around the world. And so she came and met with the students and had a discussion with them, the Pitt students at this period. All right, sorry. And this is a friend of mine, Don Purvis, who was the head of the Progressive Unionist Party, which is aligned with Loyalism. The same trip, they're having a meeting, that one day they're meeting with Monica, the very next day they're meeting with Don, getting the perspective of Loyalist politician and what the Loyalist working class is thinking of. So they get it from both sides. This is actually, everybody here knows about the Orange Order, right? Okay, the Orange Order is the traditional marching order, which 12th of July, there's always riots in Belfast over. So we went to meet with the Orange Order in East Belfast, and they got to meet with the Orange Lodge and the head of the Orange Lodge to talk about what they were doing in the period of peace, trying to move away from their sectarian past. And then this is the engagement we had. These are 3 former life prisoners. The one guy standing on the first picture, that's Tom Smith. He died in 2016. He was a Red Hand commando.
We're just waiting for you.
In the middle is Tom Roberts, UVF life prisoner, and Tom Winstow next to him, Red Hand commando or UVF life prisoner. So they had like a 2-hour-long discussion with the students about everything the students wanted to ask them, and it was a real free-flowing discussion. And to match it up, we go over on the Falls Road. And we went what's called the Felons Club, which to be a member of the Felons Club, you had to be interned or a prisoner, a Republican prisoner. So we did a tour with Republican ex-prisoners on the Falls, and then we finished up with lunch at the Felons Club. Middle picture is one of the memorial gardens on the Lower Falls Road. The final picture is actually in Derry. That's Big John McCourt. Big John is a guy who speaks to my class regularly. He was the one that served. 2 best friends were shot within 6 feet of him on Bloody Sunday and killed, and John survived that. And he was in the IRA from 1969 to 1977, and then he still is a tireless peace and human rights worker since 1977. And then this is when, through a weird series of circumstances in 2010, the brigadier staff of the Ulster Defense Association, the largest of the Loyalist paramilitary organizations, came in and had a face-to-face discussion with my students in Belfast. Good. And this is again on the fall. This on the final picture on the right, that's the peace wall from the Falls Road side. And then the picture on the left is actually at the Republican area of Milltown Cemetery, for those who've ever been there, where the hunger strikers and many other volunteers from the current conflict are buried in the graves right there. And then again, middle picture is a memorial garden on the Lower Shankill. And then this is, Lower Falls. And again, this is the guy in the blue shirt's Noel Large. He's a former UVF life prisoner who did our tours on the Shankill, and then took the students to the Peace Wall and gave him a discussion about what his view of the conflict.
You want to eat?
And fun. That's one of the women's teams I worked with, the Northland Lady Raiders from Newton Ards. Okay, these folks are all about, I would say, about 35 to 40 years old now. Okay, and then this is from my MBE presentation in April of this year. So it was like going into Downton Abbey and like Lord Grantham and
What's the
member. Yeah. So and that's it. So that's it. So I'm open. So I didn't want to ramble too long. So I'm open to give you time for questions. Okay, do
Can you speak to the economy of region in terms of wasn't there an economic turnaround in the 80s?
that was in the Republic.
Okay.
Yeah, the Celtic Tiger. That was in the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah, that was a huge surge forward. How did that happen?
That one I couldn't tell you. Okay, I'm going to give you a brief survey, but I couldn't tell you in depth. I do know, because I was actually at a conference on this back in 2005. The Irish economy was a basket case around 1980. Yeah. Business leaders, academics, and economists came together and started drawing up plans on how they could revitalize the economy. And one of the issues was education and preparing young people for a new economy.
Didn't they foresee the tech sector?
That's exactly what the education was all about.
I thought so.
Yeah. So it was about the tech sector. It was about attracting like Google, Apple, all these companies. But I couldn't tell you all the ins and outs, but I do know that took place in the early 1980s.
And that was called the Celtic Tiger.
Celtic Tiger. And they're still, last year they had a 16 billion euro surplus in the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland, unfortunately, still their economy is tied so tightly to the British economy. And after 14 years of austerity with the Tories, Northern Ireland economy has suffered as a result of that.
What you spoke about, what did the labor, can you speak anything about the labor movement and the influence and what?
Well, the labor movement, actually, I know guys who were involved in trade union movement.
Right.
And they were actually really crucial in mitigating the violence that could have taken place in the workplace. When things would happen on the streets, they were able to actually calm things in the workshops. So there weren't mass expulsions of workers like took place in other periods of history. And they calmed the sectarianism down in the workplace. They didn't have an outsized influence on a larger society, but on a micro level, they had an influence in preventing the sectarianism from taking hold too badly in the workplace.
Did that have any influence on coalitions?
In that period, coalitions weren't forming.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Judge, you have something?
Yeah, was there a difference? Can you, you seemed like you worked with prisoners, with loyalists and Republican. Was there a difference in the prison system? And
Yeah, it's interesting. The prison system, the way it operated in the early days, the British, I'm trying to, they had a traditional prison system like we would have. Old Victorian style prison called Crumlin Road Jail, which I plug for if you ever get there now. It actually has a great tour, and they've actually opened a distillery in the wing of the prison, which they did a tour of in April. But anyway, the prison system, it was becoming overwhelmed, and the prisoners themselves, they said, we're not traditional prisoners. You do not have the right to treat us as ordinary decent. The term that came up with was ODCs, ordinary decent criminals. So in 1967, Dusty actually went on hunger strike for 37 days in 1967 to give political status. Then here's the interesting thing, which we can get into it. In 1972, in Crumlin Road Jail, was overcrowded. The Loyalist prisoners and the Republican prisoners cooperated to shut the jail down. The Loyalist prisoners had all the jail jobs because they were considered loyal. They quit doing the work. The Republican prisoners went on hunger strike. Okay. And to put the pressure on the government to finally they didn't use the term political status, they call it special category status, which meant they got rights that ordinary prisoners wouldn't get. Free association, so many visits a week, more parcels. And they had to be called by their names. They weren't called by their numbers. And it had to go through, the prison staff had to go through the paramilitary structure to deal with prisoners. Right. And that took its way out. They got so overcrowded, they opened up an old Army Air Force base 7 miles south of Belfast. You all know it from the hunger strikes along Kesh, in the Maze prison. And then when they did, the other thing the prisoners did is they created no conflict zones in Crumlin Road. So if prisoners got into fights in these no conflict areas of Republicans and Loyalists, their commanders would expel them from their wings and say, you're not a member of our organization anymore. You have to go be with the ordinary decent criminals. They took this all out into the prison camp in Long Kesh. They were set up in compounds. Republicans had their own compounds. Loyalists had their own compounds. And the compounds were autonomous regions. The prison authorities had to work through the commanders of each compound in order to give orders or to do searches or whatever else. And they had to go through the command staff of each organization. This is where cooperation did develop inside the prisons. And the senior commanders of the UVF, Red Hand, INLA, UDA, I won't go through who all they represent, UDA, official IRA, and the provisional IRA, all sat on a council inside the prison called the Camp Council. Was facilitated by the prison governor, which basically they dealt with all the issues that affected all the prisoners inside. And it actually developed plans for the resettlement of prisoners once they got outside the prisons. Okay. So, but that changes in 1976 when the government decided to criminalize everybody. So if you were committed a crime before March 1st, 1976, and you got arrested in 1977 and got tried, you could get political status. But if you committed a crime on March 1st, 1976, you were put in the ordinary compounds, ordinary prisons. That's where the hunger strikes come from. Okay, that's why the hunger strikes took place, because Republican prisoners and Loyalist prisoners, the Loyalist prisoners didn't do the same thing Republicans did, but the Loyalist prisoners actually supported what the Republicans were doing because they wanted the exact same rights as the Republicans were fighting for inside the prisons.
That's amazing.
Yes.
So do you write about that?
It's in my book.
in your-
In my book, so you have to buy the book.
Yeah.
So the people that actually lived through the troubles and lived through the horrors of it are beginning to get older and perhaps passing on. What is the attitude of the younger generation who never?
Well, this is actually, there's a couple ways of looking at it, depending on what like working class areas have a different view than middle class areas, and education levels will have something to do with it. Some young people in both communities feel they lost out by not being able to be involved in the conflict and fight for the cause on both sides. I did a talk at a Protestant school in 2008, and I was like, it was 16 to 18-year-old boys, and you can imagine they were giving me stick just because that's what they're going to do. And so I said, well, what are you hoping to do? One guy, I want to be on the brute unemployment. Another one goes, I want to be an ex-prisoner. And it was so serious because to him, an ex-prisoner meant somebody who had bona fides, who could walk down the street, and people feared him or people respected him. So you have that. You have other things like Al McBride, who I mentioned earlier, was doing a talk to a group of Catholic school kids and about what happened to him and his family. The fish shop bomb, we've never heard of it. The IRA was trying to get what they thought was going to the UDA's headquarters. A meeting was going on. Meeting ended earlier, but it was above a fish shop. So they sent 2 bombers in with a bomb to blow up the fish shop to kill the people upstairs. But the bomb was supposedly set to get everybody out. Well, the bomb went off prematurely, killing 9 innocent Protestants and one of the bombers. And the UDA was long gone. But Al McBride, his wife and his father-in-law owned a shop. His wife and father-in-law were killed in the bomb. He was doing a talk to a group of, I think it was Protestant school kids. And then one kid goes to him, with all due respect, I understand your story in this, but that's your story. That's not our story. Okay. So they're looking to move on. Many young people want to move on from it. One of the interesting things, there's many people want to move on to it. But in working class areas, which have not seen the benefit of the peace process, and we're talking in both communities, there's people there was just a series of riots in the Republican area the last 3 nights down near the Lower Falls. And these are young people who are unemployed or basically see, well, what have we gotten out of the peace process? And it's a chance to riot. Okay. And there is something called recreational rioting here as well. Okay. They'll actually get on organize a riot, okay, because there's nothing to do. That's basically you have a situation where it's going to depend on who you talk to. There's a statistic I do know, and this was done in 2017. Pete Sherlow, who I know Paul, Pete Sherlow was invited to give a talk to Sinn Féin's Ardèche, their convention in 2017, and Pete's from a Loyalist Unionist background. And he basically pointed out this, and this shocked them, that the majority of Protestants under the age of 40 believe in the Union. They believe in equal marriage. They're more likely to believe in equal marriage. They're more likely to believe in the right to choose. They're more likely to believe in mixed marriages, and more likely to believe in integrated education than Sinn Féin voters. Okay, he said, and that was done through a study that Liverpool University had done. So attitudes of young people under 40 in Loyalist Unionist communities has changed a great deal. And it has in Republican communities, but there's a hardcore that's developed in both communities. And the other interesting thing, and there's an identity that's developed over the last 15 years called Northern Irish, where people can designate what their identity is now in polls. So 20% of people in the last poll that was done in 2013 designate as their first identity is Northern Irish. Okay. And then they can say Northern Irish, and then my second identity is Irish, or my second identity is British, and on and on and on. When they figured it all out, 20% said Northern Irish first, but when you add the others who said they have a Northern Irish identity, it's approximately 30% of the population now in Northern Ireland now considers they have some form of Northern Irish identity,
As opposed to
as
sectarian
opposed to being Irish or Northern Irish or British.
or sectarian.
Yeah, well, it was due, yeah, so that, well, sectarians are a little bit different in this state, but they would view themselves, they wouldn't look themselves as unionists and that were unionists or Republican nationalists in this position. They're Northern Irish. They see that identity first. And it's primarily within the unionist community, but I've actually met a number of my students I worked with who think it's great to be Northern Irish. My one student did a presentation for my history class about 10 years ago at Pitt. She was from Lisburn, and she was like, he said, I got the best of both worlds. I celebrate St. Patrick's Day. I participate in the 12th of July parades. Okay. She thought this is great. Yeah. Charlie?
Yeah.
Charlie, could we stop, because we have to.
Sure.
Don't forget what you're going to say. Okay, Richard? Is that what you're saying?
Paula's.
Oh, so,
No,
No,
Richard.
Let's see.
Paul not muted.
Richard.
okay, Richard.
Yeah, I'd just like to congratulate our speaker for trying to and seem to be successful at putting together an objective view and bringing all these people with different frames of reference into the argument. Okay. And one last comment. You should start one now on America in 2024. Because we need the same thing, objectivity.
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you.
I have a
Go
humorous
ahead.
response. So I was asked by somebody to write a piece for the Post-Gazette dealing with Northern Ireland and the Middle East. I said, you got to be crazy. Okay? And I said, because actually the interesting point, in 2014, a book came out dealing with literary theory, and I have no idea why I ended up in it. But the woman who wrote this book, the academic in France, who was originally from Northern Ireland, actually accused me, and I quote, of working to a police agenda, because I was giving an alternative vision to the Republican narrative of the peace process. So I'm not going down that road.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then Peter Gilmore.
Peter?
Hey, Tony. Once again, you are so impressive. It's a delight to hear you. As you know better than anybody, the Progressive Unionist Party was able to tap into the decades-old tradition and activities in labor politics as well as trade unionism, you know, creating a unique left perspective that we both admired. What's happened to that? There seems to be a collapse of left politics in the unionist areas. Sinn Féin has moved to the right. Thank God for people before profits. So what is how would you explain the collapse of the PUP and its left perspective?
Actually pretty, I mean, there's two main events that took place, and one took place in 2010 and the other in 2012, which basically crippled the PUP. And the other thing that's crippled any kind of progressive movement in unionism, loyalism, is the argument over the Irish seat order. But the one event that happened in 2010, a lot was going. The one woman I mentioned on purpose with my students was the head of the PUP at this time, and she was doing amazingly progressive work and working with the UVF in moving away from paramilitarism. Well, there was a dispute on the Shankill Road between some people who'd been in the UVF and the UVF leadership. Well, in broad daylight on a Friday afternoon, this guy who was having a feud with the UVF leadership, he was shot dead by the UVF in the middle of the afternoon on 2010. And it, like, Dawn eventually, she had to having to leave the party because she couldn't get them to do anything she wanted. And she was not going to be associated with that. And that really put everybody back. Well, see, it doesn't matter what you say, you're still the same old thing. And they ended up retreating back into their bunkers again. The other one occurred in 2012, which really crippled the Progressive Unionist Party. Yeah, when you look at the programs of even when Sinn Féin, even before it went to the right, the PUP was way more left-wing than any other political party in Northern Ireland. They still kept as clause 4 of the Labor Party's constitution, which Tony Blair had gotten rid of, which said all wealth of the nation belongs to the people. And so anyway, the city government council in Belfast decided it right before Christmas, we're going to take the flag down, British flag down off City Hall, which I mean, really, and I've been going there for years. I didn't even know the flag flew on City Hall. Okay. But it used to fly 365 days a year. But in the rest of the UK, all cities basically fly the flag on 17 specific days. So they actually worked it. They passed a resolution. They'll fly it 17 days. Well, the loyalist population viewed this as another de-Britification of Northern Ireland. Another step on taking their identity away, led to 6 weeks of rioting, okay, very vicious rioting in Belfast. And what the PUP, to its credit, tried to do, Peter, and this is where it goes into, it tried to channel that anger. They actually said, instead of going on streets, here's these letters, sign this letter and deliver it to your council person, deliver it directly saying this, that, and the other thing. And then what they did is they started recruiting people who were involved in the flag protest, say, join the party. We'll fight for your British identity and fight for Ulster. And we'll do this. We'll help you out. We'll also get you we'll do other things for you. Well, they actually brought me and Aaron Edwards, who teaches at Sandhurst. He's from Belfast. We were commissioned to develop education programs to be used to socialize the leadership, the people who were coming into the PUP from the outside into the values of the PUP. In that way, you're coming in because of the flag. You're coming in because of lack your identity. Well, that's great. We'll protect that, but we're also going to teach you about your labor history. We're going to teach you about what you should be doing about education, what you should be doing about the National Health Service. Well, nobody wanted to hear this. And what ended up happening, instead of the PUP driving them to the left, they drive the PUP to the left. Okay, and the PUP went to the right. And eventually, as we saw it over the years, it just became a working class version of the DUP, the more right-wing political parties in Northern Ireland. So yeah, and that crippled it because why join the PUP? It was there's a new party called the T. There's so many parties. It's the land of acronyms. Join the True Ulster Voice. Join the DUP. So yeah, just like. And one of the other things that hurt, even though they tried to keep on, gas dispensers and David Irvine's death were critical to losing that progressive voice and that public voice that people would listen to and respect. That they didn't have that type of leadership after that either.
If I could ask a quick follow-up. So in what way does Linda Irvine and her organization fill a void? And for the benefit of everybody else, Linda Irvine was the sister-in-law of David Irvine, founder of the PUP and wife of his brother Brian. She valiantly set up a school in East Belfast, in the heart of Loyalist East Belfast, to teach the Irish language. And it's grown. It's gone from success to success, as they say. So how do you explain that?
What happens, I guess, is that don't ever look at what's, as people always say in Belfast, don't look what's happening at high politics. Look at what's happening on the ground. So like ACT, which, you don't look at what's going on in the politics. What's ACT doing on the grassroots level? It's actually decommissioning, demobilizing people and reintegrating them into civilian life. What's going on with both Republican and Loyalist communities with restorative justice programs? They're actually reintegrating their own communities again. What's going on with all these mediation groups that are working together at the grassroots level? They're mitigating what could go on wrong at the grassroots level. So Linda would be part of that, where Linda has worked tirelessly. I'll follow up on it. There's over 1,000 Protestants in East Belfast studying Irish now. Okay. And they've opened up an integrated Irish language free school in East Belfast in the Brannel estate, which is a Loyalist estate in East Belfast. But it's there's a lot, and this is going on in both communities. So as people say, don't pay attention to what's happening in high politics. Look at what people are doing at the grassroots level. Okay. Who's
Um,
I do, but other people would.
let's have Charlie and then Kate and then Bill.
okay? Good, Charlie.
Yeah, I just want to personally not forget Kate Deere, who wants to do a petition on Palestine at the end. But my question was about similar to us, Belfast endured industrial collapse with its shipbuilding as kind of the background to all of this. Could you just comment on how the economy has changed so radically?
What the economy has done with that, it's education based, it's arts based. You know, you have a thriving arts theater community in Belfast. I mean, there's just so much great theater, not only like at the Opera House and Lyric Theater, but like I don't know if anybody folks here had a chance. There was a theater group came through Pittsburgh back in last fall called Kibosh. Did anybody know of it? There was a brilliant. There's this. This is a tangential to this, but I have to get it. Woman Paula McFettridge, who has been working at theater level in Belfast. This also ties to Peter's question. They get events that have happened in Northern Ireland or processes. They interview all these people. Then they hire about what happened. Then they hire playwrights to write the play, and then they get actors to perform it. And the performance that they used in Pittsburgh was called The Blue and the Green, and they got all these narratives from Garda, the police force in the Republic, and the RUC, who served on the border, and they wrote a play about their experiences on the border. And they're doing one right now they're in the process of writing it now on the Women's Coalition. They're actually working on one about because nobody's talked about it. What went on in the prisons? Was there homosexuality in the prisons? It's never been talked about. Okay, so they're working on that. But anyway, so theater is going on, arts are going on big time. You have tourism is huge in Belfast. Lonely Planet has one of the top 10 places to live or to visit for years. Okay, the last few years. So it's got that. Education has been part. Technology, bringing it in, has been part of it. They do so. That's where it's revitalized. But if you go through, I went through Belfast in April when I was back. The city center has kind of gotten hollowed out a little bit, and you go into the local communities. You go up to East Belfast on the Newton Arms Road now. It looks like a Potemkin village. They have a lot of boarded up storefronts, and they've painted street scenes. So like a fruit grocers, but there's no fruit grocers there. But in order to make it look like it's alive, as they try to bring things back, they've tried to rebuild, creating integrated communities and things like that. But it's not recovered. It's like it didn't have the advantages Pittsburgh had, which was not coming out of a sectarian war, and also all the universities. But like the universities have been crucial in helping out with the redevelopment there. Further than that, I couldn't speak on the economy. Yeah.
Yeah. So from what I've been gathering about much of what you've been saying, you know, like, you entered like learning about all this that like the conflict had already erupted and such, and like the rifts and stuff that already happened, and in all the different ways you can kind of look at this, like managing like unity and like a path towards like a more peaceful way of life is a big part, like maybe even the main part, because that's just sort of where we're at. But of course with this and like any kind of like violence at that level, there's sort of like an instigating factor, but also like for decades stuff like this can be like simmering. And I don't know how much of your time is spent thinking of like, well, things have gone differently in this, that, or the other way, simply because it's like, well, that's not what happened, you know.
There were, as people have said, this was not inevitable. This was not inevitable. People made conscious choices. That people who were involved in the conflict on the ground will tell you, like they will tell you, you know, I made a choice. You know, there's people in the same families who didn't make the same choice. People whose brothers went to prison for murder, and one brother went to prison for murder, the other became a lawyer or a professor. So, and even in the 1960s, it could have gone differently, but people made specific choices, which when things could have been, if it had been given time, could have actually, the violence didn't have to. Now, my point, the violence that broke out in 1969 did not have to happen.
So are there like any like nuggets of wisdom or lessons that you've learned or gathered in relationship to like implementing change in a serious but peaceful way, and perhaps thoughts in relationship to calling out or disarming voices advocating for violence as solutions to?
Well, yeah, again, this is where it was brought up about here, we've really called for toning down the rhetoric. In the 1960s, and this is actually was a good question because I've talked with a number of paramilitaries over the last couple of years I've been back, and they all say the same thing. You're in the position we were in the 1960s. Because you have Ian, like when Terrence O'Neill, who was the prime minister, came as a reforming prime minister, trying to reconcile the two communities, trying to bring businesses into Northern Ireland, trying to have a rapprochement with the South. And all of a sudden you got people like Ian Paisley shouting on the street, you're a sellout. You're like a bridge. You're like a bridge and a trader are like the same thing because they both go over to the other side. Okay. So any compromise in this period by people like Paisley was seen as a sellout of the Union. Conversely, what people haven't really, like, it's been studied, but not talked about a whole lot. Like radical groups that emerged, not just the IRA in the 1960s, they saw themselves as part of the vanguard of the worldwide revolution. So even when O'Neill began to reform the political system, they saw that as an opportunity to push him even further and faster. And their idea was, and this was stated by both the IRA and some of the student groups, radical groups, is okay, we're going to push them for reforms we know they can never give us. That will show the illegitimacy of the state. The state, everybody will join our revolution and the state will collapse. And actually, it's in a book about the IRA, and people did it. One guy, I was at a conference in 2011 with people who were involved in the IRA at that period. And when we were talking about it, and one of the guys said, when we were actually, what did you think? He said, we never thought it would collapse that fast. And they didn't think it would collapse. They thought they could control the revolution.
Sounds like our bills.
Well, yeah, basically they couldn't. They thought, okay, we'll get people on the street fighting for civil rights. We'll push for this. We'll push for that. Well, what they didn't realize is the sectarian genie was underneath it. And a 15, 16-year-old with a rock in his hand isn't listening to you about Marxist theory. Okay. And so that was that. So that, yeah. So yeah, so you had people who on both sides who were raising the temperature. On the left side was like, okay, we're going to force the state to reform, and if it can't reform, then as Cal Golding, who was the head of the IRA, said, if everything in reform fails, then we go back to the traditional solution, the armed struggle. Okay, and even McCann, who was a leader of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. From Derry, he reflected later in life. He says, we didn't realize what we didn't. I don't have the exact phrase, but realizing they didn't realize how intense how it would explode in the way it did. They couldn't once the violence started on the street, they couldn't pull it back in again. So yeah, so it's like, but do we ever learn from the past? Okay. Historians will study the past and then and are condemned to sit by and watch while people do it. And nobody listens. Okay. And nobody listens to us. Okay. Stimpy?
Yeah, I just want to suggest that anyone here who wants to take, are you going to do your class?
Yeah, the class will be next spring.
I signed up through Osher. So you can sign up for Pitt classes through Osher. $200 to join Osher.
Yeah.
Funny as a task method, is a lot of reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a lot of reading. Okay. Yeah. I'm teaching a class on the Great War this fall. It's going to be worse. Okay. In terms of reading. Okay. Because it's the cultural history of the Great War. Okay. Which actually goes to your question, because what we do examining is what were the circumstances between 1870 and 1914, not simply at the political military level, but what was happening culturally and socially in all societies, which made it so easy for millions of people to acquiesce in mass slaughter in 1914 to 1945. Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah.
In terms of the collapse of the left and the progressive things you were talking about, you talk about it politically, but did the economy reflect on that? The Celtic Tiger, or was there a seduction of capital?
The Celtic Tiger is separate from Northern Ireland.
Right, but I mean, did it have overflow and influence where people saw that as their political identity moved?
Yeah, because if you're a unionist, or a loyalist, it didn't matter how good the Republican economy is doing. You're not going to be part of that, because even now, like economically, Northern Ireland's better off with the Irish sea border than it is without the sea border. But for loyalists and unionists, what that means is, because they're both economically, they're in the EU, politically, they're in the United Kingdom. Okay, so what that means to unionists and loyalists, many of them, is this: you're essentially treating the island of Ireland as one economic unit.
Right.
That's the next step to ending partition. Yeah, that's the next step on the road to United Ireland. Yeah.
In terms of when you talk about the political influence, of course, the religious influence, but was there other cultural difference between the surfaces of each group that alienated from each? Like I tend to, when I talk to people in here in politics and labor and things like that, reflect on the influence of popular culture. Was there an older culture and a popular culture that influenced that?
Well, I mean, in terms of historically in Northern Ireland, the fear within the unionist loyalist community was always that they were going to be memories of 1641, which was a massacre in Ulster, which killed about 4,000 Protestants, about 25% of the population at that time. Peter, did I get the number right? Was it 4,000 Protestants killed during the 1641?
I don't think anybody knows. Of course, John Locke estimated that there were more Protestants killed than there were Protestants. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, and the reports in the 1640s, 100,000 Protestants died in the slaughter, but there were 12,000 Protestants in Ulster at the time. So, but basically, the fear was always from the time Northern Ireland was founded in 1921 or created in 1921. For unionist loyalists, they set up a state specifically to make sure that would never be a threat to their place in the United Kingdom. So Catholics to them were always seen as a fifth column, prepared to slaughter them in their beds, sell them out, and take them into a United Ireland. So that was always their fear. And so they ended up setting up a state in which they completely excluded the Catholic population from the economic benefits of an industrialized society. And they also kept them they made sure, you could participate in politics, but it didn't mean anything. So that was always that fear. So from the founding of Northern Ireland, it was always this fear. Peter could do a good lecture on the long-term fear between Presbyterians and Catholics and the established church. But in terms of the period from 21 to 1966, when this breaks out, it's basically, for the unionist loyalists, it's always about, are we going to be sunk into a United Ireland? Are we going to be sold out? And for Catholic nationalists, many had actually come to terms with living in Northern Ireland, but there was always a hardcore that was basically, we need to reunite Ireland at the point of a gun. Okay, because the interesting thing is, even to this day, the statistics are, there still is about between 30 to 35% of the nationalist population who would not vote for a United Ireland if there was a vote tomorrow, and who would vote maybe in 30 to 40 years. Okay, because many people, and Peter knows this as well, is many people in the nationalist community benefited from the Labour Party's reforms after World War II. Okay, because education was open to all, okay, Catholic and Protestant, because if you passed an exam called the 11 plus after labor reforms, you got free education all the way through university. And Catholic parents, my generation in particular, they knew their kids were never going to get jobs in the shipyards. What did they do? They prepared their kids for the 11 plus. And because Protestant kids knew they could get jobs, linen mills, aerospace, shipyards, apprenticeships, Catholics knew. So that generation that came of age in the 1960s who became the student radicals, guess what? They were all educated for free by the British government. And then, so this is, and then the National Health Service, even though it has its problems now because of the Tories, is essentially, as it was still the jewel of the crown of what it means to be British. Okay, and for many people, pensions are better, welfare system is better than in the south of Ireland, education system in the north is better than it is in the south of Ireland. So if they're ever going to have a unification, there's going all this stuff has to be worked out.
Is it all resources and institutions vastly that different in terms of opportunity?
Well, if you're looking at terms of like the healthcare system, the educational system, who runs the educational system, how your pensions are doled out, who the civil servants are, all those things have to be taken into account. Yeah, Richard. Okay, Richard. Yeah. You guys are wearing me out.
I'm gonna suggest a weird thing here, okay? But follow me. In 1951, there was a science fiction movie called The Day the World Stood Still. Okay.
Best movie, one of the best movies ever made.
So the theme of it is a saucer lands near the United States Capitol. Everybody is in fear. Out comes Klaatu. He looks like us, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, 2 eyes, and 2 ears. And he comes here for a purpose. And his purpose is out there somewhere where the Webb telescope goes. There is a united field of planets, of intelligent beings well ahead of us. And Klaatu says, we noticed that you left a big cloud on your planet called an atomic bomb. We're here to talk to you about that. And it's a great story. It's simplistic, but of course, humankind try to kill Klaatu, okay, because they're afraid of him. And eventually, after he integrates into the human race and he finds out we're not all bad, he comes back and he brings out this huge robot. Okay. And then, of course, when that comes out, all the tanks and people come around and his robot melts the tank. And finally, they shoot and kill Klaatu. Okay. His robot picks him up, takes him back in. The moral of the story is you people have to talk as a collective whole. And the final end is if you don't, your planet will be a cinder. Okay. There's a lot of what you've all just talked about there in that simple 1951 movie. And I'm waiting for Klaatu to come. Thank you and goodbye.
That actually ties to Big John. And because when Big John talks to my class, because Big John had no hesitation taking up the gun in 1969. But he said what he learned over years, the force of argument was much stronger than the argument of force, which was one of the things he told the students. That's right. Yeah. And the other thing, is all the people I've talked to on the grassroots level, and because you've probably heard, it's actually, I don't know why it happened or how it happened, but I was extremely fortunate and lucky to be able to have connections across the political and sectarian divide in Northern Ireland. People from both communities talking to me. They all said the same thing. Talking to your friends is easy. Talking to your enemies is what you got to do.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because you can talk to your friends, that's the easy part. But you got to talk to your enemies. Because how do you defeat your enemy if you don't know what drives them? Okay. And how do you, or not, not even say defeating them, but learn, like I said, blunt the argument or whatever if you don't understand why they're fighting to begin with or why they oppose you.
Sutherland lost his job at Yale because he said we have to negotiate with the Viet Cong, not North Vietnam, but the Viet Cong. They're the people that have to be at the table to have any peace.
Well, like they said in The Godfather, keep your friends close, keep your enemies close.
Yeah. And this is what, it took a long time in Northern Ireland because in '74, the first year I went there was during the Sunningdale Agreement, which is the first power sharing agreement. And in Northern Ireland, the Ulster Protestant working class I got there and like a month after I got there, they completely shut down Northern Ireland for 15 days. British rule ceased to exist in Northern Ireland for 15 days. We didn't have power, we didn't have we had two rolling blackouts, they controlled the power. Anyway, the point of that, just what you were saying, is when they came to the Sunningdale Agreement, the British government incorporated all the quote unquote respectable parties in the discussions. The paramilitaries or their representatives weren't at the table. It had no chance of succeeding.
Mhm.
The Good Friday Agreement, the representatives of all the paramilitary groups were at the tables on both loyalist and Republican sides. And that's what, yeah. And that, because, they might, so people would argue, well, why would you talk to gunmen? Why would you talk to murderers? Well, if you don't talk to the people with the guns, how are you going to end it? How are you going to end the conflict? You have to be prepared to kill them all. Yeah.
When I was in Northern Ireland before the peace accord and during the marching season mid-July, and we were kind of stuck in our hotel because they did decide, they decided 2 o'clock in the morning whether the troops will come in or not. And since they did, they kind of shut down all the tours and things. So anyway, my take on that was it seemed very similar to our the way the Catholics were treated was similar to the way the blacks in our country are treated, and the neighborhood looked the same because the buildings, the cars were on fire, and the buildings then, looked like they'd been damaged. So it reminded me of after the MLK assassination or Rodney King or something like that. That was the way Belfast looked. And then the language that was used, the same kind of insulting, offensive language about, seemed similar.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Republican and the civil rights movement consciously modeled itself after Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. It was they sang the same songs, they had the same slogans, and it was consciously mirroring the civil rights movement here in the United States. And then when the violence broke out in 1969, then you saw like Watts, Los Angeles, Newark, Detroit. That's what it looked like in Derry and Belfast. Except it ended up kickstarting the very long war that took place 25 years. I think people were getting tired. The last is
Becoming depressed.
the one thing, as I always tell people, I said, when I was going to speak, I said, the number one fear, I always ask people, what's the number one fear of Americans before death? Speaking in public. My number one fear, your time's up. Go ahead.
So Tony, how have you found that your bartending career has informed your academic?
It allowed me to pay for graduate school. Bartended all the way through my PhD. Okay. And so, I was bartending bartended in Northern Ireland, bartended in the Sunnyside in the 80s. I bartended at Croatian Club in Duquesne, bartended at Kyoto. And I used to I did a lot of weddings, but no, I mean, one of the things you ended up, you always had interesting experiences. Kyoto's, we were relatively violence free or fun, but you always got somebody you had to worry about, and you had to learn to talk people down. And I'll just use an example. One night I came in to close up for Joe one night, and we had a young bartender, and this was towards the end before we're closing. And there was a guy, he said, this guy, I'm really worried about him. He hasn't brought his hands up behind the bar, underneath the bar. And I said, I looked at him, I recognized him. I'd thrown him out 6 months earlier. And so he didn't remember I threw him out. So I went over and started chatting to him. And so he was sitting across. So I just kept chatting to him. And I kept getting closer and closer and just kept talking to him, because if he brought the gun up, I would be able to grab it. He didn't have one, fortunately. But I kept talking to him until he found out that I knew somebody that he knew that he was related to. And I just kept, I must have talked 15 minutes. He said, you don't know me. I said, yes, I do. You're so-and-so's cousin. And then it went on like this, and he eventually left with like quiet. But it was like I had to just keep talking. It still could have ended badly, but I just kept talking to him until it wound down.
I'd just like to offer a bridge to Palestine in terms of Michael Collins and in Ireland, and when he had to sit down with Winston Churchill and negotiate the separation of the 6 counties, his death warrant was signed,
Yeah, he said that.
and he was executed by his closest
Yeah,
comrades.
in an ambush.
Yes. I've talked to the Palestinian Center in Youngstown, and the elder there, who's very wise, and he and I got aside with him, and I said, to me, there was a moment when Yasser Arafat could have accepted the best offer they were ever going to get. He would have been killed.
Yeah.
He died shortly after anyway.
Yeah.
But it was the best moment for
Yeah.
peace. And did he think there was some legitimacy to seeing it that way? If he had had the courage to grab that thing, he would have died. There's
Yeah.
no question.
Like Anwar Sadat.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it would have opened a door
Yeah.
that has been incredibly shut absolutely ever since.
Yeah.
And I just
Yeah, but others would argue Michael Collins got it wrong in 1921 and should have continued the war against the British. Okay.
But don't you think that maybe that one thing that's been underrated and had true potential but died in a vine was the Arab Spring?
Well, I'm not
You know,
going down this road. I said I'm not going down this road. Okay, my areas are. I'm not an expert on the Middle East, and I'm not going to pretend to be. Okay.
Parallel.
You can look parallels, but I'm not going to go down that road.
There is one parallel, and that's Lord Bell.
Yeah, yeah, and even the person who drew the borders.
He drew the border.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the.
Oh yeah.
That it.
Well, we do cover that in a great work because we cover how they promised the Arabs the right of self-determination. They promised the Zionists a homeland, and they then decided we're going to make all these protectorates.
I just want to go down there. Rashid Khaledi's new book called 100 Years Before, is the book on Palestine, and it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And if you don't know, that's like a really good place to start, and it's a bestseller rate.
Yeah. Well, and I'll finish off with it, but to tie this together, Big John argues it's not religion that radicalizes you. It's not ancient hatreds and going back thousands of years. It's oppression. It's lack of job opportunities. It's being treated as a second-class citizen in your own country. Those are the things that motivate people, no matter what country, no matter what situation that you're in terms of doing these things. Okay. I'll do one more. Do one more. Go ahead.
Will Ireland be united?
I would have said up until Brexit, I would have said not in my lifetime. But because of Brexit, they've definitely accelerated. Because this is one of your questions earlier, because for a number of middle class unionists and people with small unionism, basically are like going, okay, we're operating the UU, it's better off. Maybe down the road we'll vote for it. Okay. But there's a lot to be worked out before they can even do that.
And they're already burblings about it. They talk about what the flag would look like.
Yeah.
They're already like little.
Yeah, because there's very much Sinn Féin has really been at the forefront.
Yeah.
They were just here in Pittsburgh a couple months ago. Paul Maskey.
Right, I saw.
Yeah, I was there at that thing, and yeah, they're doing all this drawing up support for it. But again, as the British told the IRA as early as 1972. You don't have to convince us to leave. We'll leave. I mean, they told the IRA this in 1972. The people you have to convince are the people that live here, that they have a place in the United Ireland. And this ties together with what many loyalists have said. You're not going to convince me by putting a gun to my head. And so some loyalist unionists would argue is that actually the IRA set back the cause of unification by their armed struggle because they alienated even moderate Protestants. And I know I was talking to friends of mine who were in their 40s during the elections who said, you know what? I don't like anybody in the unionist these are unionists. I don't like any of the unionist politicians, but I can't vote for Sinn Féin because of what they did to my community. Okay, so that's the thing that they really are going to have to struggle to overcome. Okay, and I'm not saying they were right or wrong or whatever here. I'm saying from the loyalist perspective, they actually set the cause of unification back, because you want to convince me to be in the United Ireland, then don't kill me. Okay.
We also have to provide individual and collective opportunity, and both sides have to realize that. You just said it wasn't religion, it wasn't everything else.
Yeah.
It was the individual and collective development. It's imperative.
Yes, but you're talking unification?
No, I'm talking about in terms of people's opportunities, you know, educate, just about education, culture, a sense of belonging, a sense of safety that allows them to develop, their children to develop.
Well, here's it. Northern Ireland has the strictest anti-discrimination laws in all of Europe and America. Okay. And actually, the civil service and much private employment now, I think I just saw it yesterday, employment is now primary, like over 50% of people employed in Northern Ireland are now Catholic. Okay. And because they really, over the years, the laws were changed so dramatically to make sure that no discrimination. Yes.
Is it like here with women or blacks, there's a glass ceiling?
That I couldn't speak to.
I wonder because when I was there last winter, well, I was in the Republic, but I was visiting a family where the daughter was married to a guy from a Northern Irish family. Anyway, and I gather they actually said he retired early because he couldn't go any farther up. So he went to work for his wife, who has a company, and most of her plans are in Boston. The reason why they're living there rather than the US is for their children.
Yeah,
They thought to get better education.
Yeah, if he was stopped from moving up in because of his religion, then he had a discrimination lawsuit, he would have won. Okay. Yeah, he would have won that easily. Okay.
I think he thought he'd get a better deal with his wife's company. It's not
yeah. Okay.
It was some union.
Okay, Tony, I think we'll give you a time to catch your breath, and then people can come up and talk to you.
Thank you. I actually brought the MBE medal with me.
Glorious.
Aren't you wearing it?
Yeah, there you go. Wow.
Well, thank you. This was truly a magnificent start our Wednesday. There. Do we still have on? Oh, there we go.
Sure. Okay.
We eat.
Oh,
All.
there you go.
We have a few words. Rosemary is taking a picture.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Yes, that's your post on your meeting. Okay, here we have a plug for my. Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Tony.
Wait.
Hey, Tony.
Hi, Paul, how you doing?
Okay, when are you coming to Liverpool? You, me, and Pete could go and drink some good beer here sometime. So make sure you come to Liverpool.
Be in Belfast. I'm coming over to Belfast for a play about David Irvine in September. I'll be in Belfast the 19th through the 24th. In case you pop over to Belfast to see this one.
Right, I might do. My friend, my old student Bruce Campbell, a professor of history at Queen's. He lives in in Belfast half the time, and also on the Donegal coast. So he's always trying to get me over there. So I may well do that.
Yeah, we're going to the play on the 20th. The Man Who Swallowed a Dictionary.
Okay.
It's a play about David Irvine. It's a one-man play with David Irvine, written by Dino Niblock, who's a former Red Hand life prisoner, and it's gotten absolute rave reviews.
And when did you last see our old student Sherlock, who seems to have done rather well for himself, doesn't he?
Peter, I haven't seen Pete in person for a few years, but I heard he was ill. Did he have a heart attack?
That I don't know, but he's still in harness in the Institute of Irish Studies here.
Yeah, I heard he was ill. Something happened to him recently, but I don't know anything.
He's good. He's good now.
Oh, is he good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He said he's okay now. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Good to see you, Paul. Make sure you pop over for the play. Good to see you. Bye.
You know, Mark Rylance is going to do Juno and the Paycock in London starting in September.
Oh my God. We're in London for it. All right. Well, thank you folks so much.
Thank you
for everything. Yes. Oh.